We're being introduced.
Welcome to this afternoon's Music Education talk. Thanks so much for coming. My name is James Humberstone, and I'm just going to do intros and then run a Q&A. And for those of you who this is your first About Music Education talk, we keep these lectures short. The idea is to be inspiring, provocative, or both. I'm sure we'll get a bit of both today. And then to open up to the floor for questions. So see what you can think of while you're listening to what I'm sure is going to be a fantastic talk. One of my favourite subjects as well. Last semester, one of my fourth year classes baited me on this very question, and I found later on my rant on why duration has nothing to do with duration on Facebook. And so that's probably enough said about that. I think this is a really, really good talk to be having, and I would love it if you would welcome our Chair of Music Education and PhD candidate, Michael Webb and Christine Carroll.
Thank you. We good to go? So I'll start for about the first 10 or 12 minutes, and then Christine will follow me. Our title's slightly changed from the one advertised, but I kept the provocative music concept crisis up, and subtitles changed slightly, rescuing musicianship from impoverishment in the classroom. So now I just have to do a switch to another PowerPoint here. So this is my umbrella term. Musicianship today, in what I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes, encompasses these three areas: performance, composition, and musicology. So this is, in a sense, a visual definition for you. I'm operating from this model, that we have this notion of musicianship which encompasses performance, composition, and musicology. My argument this afternoon is that music analysis, which has been more or less cleaved from musicology in the lower secondary school curriculum, year 7 to 10, in New South Wales, has, in the words of the French sociologist Jacques Ellul, been technicised. That is, rendered efficient, and so diminished in the process. I also contend that musicology, a vital component of musicianship, is obscured in the stages 4 and 5 syllabuses, the years 7 to 10 syllabuses, and that this exacerbates the diminishing of music analysis. In stage 6, so just keep this umbrella in mind for diagram for what follows. So here's a quick summary of the points I've just made in my argument. Analysis cleared from musicology, technicised, obscured in the syllabus, hindered by lack of explanatory coherence. So my point here, in the stage 6 or the years 11 and 12 syllabuses, where musicology appears in name, a clearer understanding of what it involves or connotes is hindered by some lack of explanatory coherence. Finally, overall, the development of secondary school musicology has been arrested due to its lack of engagement with the wider intellectual discoveries and critical frameworks that have emerged over the past 50 years. So there's the components of my argument. So I'll start with a question: how do we rescue music analysis in secondary schools from this fate? And my answer is by thoughtfully integrating it with a more robust musicology toward the inculcation among students of what Roger Johnson terms a critically reflexive musicianship. I think I have my question and answer here. So I've got a few practical suggestions of how this might be achieved, but I'll leave those to the end. First, I'll state what I mean more specifically by music analysis for the purposes of this presentation. Then I'll discuss the near invisibility of musicology in the junior secondary school years and its curious double identity in the senior secondary years. Next, I'll outline the sorts of things that I mean by technicisation, following which I'll explain how I believe the activity has been and is being diminished. As I said, I'll conclude by very briefly noting some of the ways we might address these problems. So my first point, music analysis, concepts of music. By music analysis, I mean the classroom activities conducted in conjunction with the analytical schema known as concepts of music. Duration, pitch, dynamics and expressive techniques, tone, colour, texture, structure. That's from the music year 7 to 10 syllabus. Beyond New South Wales, these are commonly known as elements. In various guises and in different combinations, they've long served as useful categories for identifying and discussing aspects of the how music works part of musicology. In terms of variant schemas, It's instructive to consider eminent ethnomusicologist Mark Sloban's thinking about what he calls music's components, which he discusses briefly in his book, Folk Music, A Very Short Introduction. Like all music, Sloban writes, folk music is naturally made up of 4 components. These he lists as pitch, duration, timbre, and intensity. Note that in Sloban's schema, pitch and duration encompass texture and structure, and expressive techniques involve all 4 of his categories. So it's even more compact and in some ways more accurate schema, I think. My second point, musicology's obfuscation. In the lower secondary music syllabuses, that is stages 4 or 5, or music years 7 to 10, musicology is obscured. Its presence is more implied than clearly articulated in this syllabus, which I believe prevents it from being effectively understood and hence taught. Nowhere is musicology clearly presented as a key component of musicianship, yet it is an expected outcome of learning. According to the syllabus, students will be led to, quote, understand and appreciate social, cultural, geographical, and historical contexts. So that's the first place that it appears. Also, it forms the foundation of one of the 3 learning experiences, the others being performing and composing. Quote, listening, it states, should be taught as a means of extending oral awareness and communicating ideas about music in social, cultural, and historical contexts. End of quote. It's from the syllabus as well. Finally, another quote, students, and I think this one's up here, students study music from a variety of contexts. These contexts, which it defines as styles, periods, and genres, are usually studied through specific topics. However, teachers of the mandatory course, which is essentially the Year 9 and 10 elective music course, may use alternative methods from the study of topics, the syllabus says. But what these alternative methods might be is not clearly spelled out. In the 3 stage 6 syllabuses, which apply to years 11 and 12, musicology appears in 2 forms. In the Music 2 syllabus, it appears in name and always in tandem with oral, that is, musicology and oral. Musicology, the syllabus states, refers to the study of musical styles, periods, and genres. This occurs through listening, score observation, analysis, performance, and composition. So that's a quote from the syllabus as well. Put this way, musicology incorporates the other key components of musicianship, performance, and composition, to the point where it might be observed musicology equals musicianship. In the Music 2 course, musicology and oral skills are assessed through a listening exam. In the Music 2 extension course, musicology is assessed through an extended research essay. In the Music 1 syllabus, a listed objective is the development of, quote, knowledge and skills about the concepts of music and of music as an art form through performance, composition, musicology, and oral activities in a variety of cultural and historical contexts, end of quote. In assessment terms, musicology is catered for in the form of a viva voce option. So you've got a different kind of assessment in the Music 1 syllabus and program. According to the assessment support documents, and I quote, the musicology viva voce is a 2-way discussion between examiner and student in which the student must demonstrate an understanding of the concepts of music in topics studied. The viva voce must have a musical focus based on extensive listening, end of quote. So a highbrow, lowbrow ideological thinking appears to inform the oral written nature of the Music 2, Music 1 assessment format distinction. This all requires further analysis and discussion, but since I've only got no minutes left, I must move on. My third point is the technic-ization of music analysis. For Jacques Ellul, technique is, quote, the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency in every field of human activity. The concept of music schema is presented in the New South Wales syllabus as a handy tool for comprehending aspects of the ways music works. As it is frequently implemented, the schema has a built-in tendency to direct focus away from music towards the discrete concepts and what might be termed subconcepts, so that the subservience of the tool to the phenomenon is turned on its head. The tool, being the concepts, becomes the thing, and music sort of vanishes somewhat. In my secondary music education methods classes here at the Con, with students who have been exposed to this kind of teaching, I sometimes find it necessary to propose the following mantra as a corrective. We are studying music, not concepts. In subtle and unintended ways, the Music 2 syllabus promotes this reversal in such passages as the following. Students will gain understanding, these are from the syllabus, will gain understanding of the musical concepts through the integration of experiences in performance, composition, musicology, and oral. And the second quote, while students will develop knowledge and skills that pertain to each of the individual areas of performance, composition, musicology, and oral, the integration of experiences in these areas acts as a tool towards the understanding and manipulation of the concepts of music in different musical contexts. I confess that the meaning of that paragraph is not entirely clear to me. However, notice that the focus has shifted from understanding the ways music works to understanding and manipulating the concepts. The latter is a rather awkwardly expressed idea or process. How do you manipulate concepts in relation to music? I'm not really quite sure. I confess that the meaning, so without the enriching musicological dimensions I mention in a moment, in use the concept schema tends to flatten the music as well as the listening experience, resulting in what Feld and Fox have referred to as, quote, the reification of musical sound structure as a decontextualized code. As a technicized approach to analysis, the concept schema is presumably intended to streamline and make more objective the assessment process. There's a tendency, however, to reward students who have been prepared by teachers to offer strings or clusters of technical words and Italian musical terms. As a result of its historical associations with Western art music and score reading, the concept schema tends to lead to a concentration on, quote, the discrete macrosyntactic, that is melody, rhythm, tonality, mode, score-centric and transcribed or transcribable dimensions of musical products, while simplifying the gradient, nuanced, emergent, oral, or micro-parameters of musical processes like pitch, texture, timbre, tempo, dynamics, and performance. That's also from Feld and Fox. The ethnomusicologist Tim Rice wrote recently, and I'll quote him, whereas music may once have been defined as pleasing sounds organized around such reliable elements as melody, harmony, and rhythm, some modern music has added to or subtracted from those elements in ways that challenge any simple understanding of what music might be. Thus, Rice implies that in our understandings, we now have to navigate between musical universals and particularities, as well as with new developments, grapple with new developments. In the book Every Song Ever, a consideration of music in the age of streaming, the music critic Ben Ratliff, and it's a 2016 book, Ben Ratliff writes, and I quote him, the most significant progress in the recent history of music has to do with listening. In the book, Ratliff argues that we need to change, quote, how we build a conscious framework or a rationale to listen to all kinds of music. And there's a lot more to be said about that, but I've got to jump on. Just another couple of little bits to say. My fourth point, school musicology's diminishment. Very briefly, musicology has changed dramatically over the past 50 years in response to a heightening awareness of the impact on music's production, performance, and reception of historical processes and movements such as imperialism, decolonization, and globalization, as well as cultural factors including gender and race, for example. Generally, school musicology has not adequately kept abreast of the discoveries of such newer sub-disciplines as ethnomusicology, popular music studies, film music studies, new jazz studies, music performance studies, and so on. And my final point, a few practical suggestions, even more briefly. We can reinvigorate school musicology, I propose, by rethinking and rewording the syllabuses. We should not underestimate the power of those documents in the hands of teachers and the way they shape thinking. Besides getting the balance right at the pre-service level, we could introduce the Viva Voce into stage 4 and 5 programs as a mode of learning. So I'm not just simply suggesting that it be introduced as a technique of assessment, but it form a whole approach to the way we learn. So what people commonly call researching these days, which everybody does, even if it's only for buying a pair of thongs. So, and we should do that, I suggest, towards inculcating a more critically reflective musicianship in younger students, perhaps beginning with a storytelling approach. More than anything, we have to, one idea of what I mean by a storytelling approach is, say, I don't know if anyone's seen the film of some years ago called The Red Violin, but the film follows the musical instrument through different cultural epochs and through different centuries. So the whole impact of what's going on in the different places that the same instrument that's crafted in a workshop in Italy ends up in the Cultural Revolution in China some 400 years later. So that kind of telling of a story about what happens to instruments which tell stories about music and so on and so forth is what I'm advocating perhaps. More than anything, my final sentence or two here, we have to teach in such a way as to communicate that we believe music is more than mere sound. Music teaching and learning should be dedicated to ever-deepening understandings of how, as Mark Slobin puts it, and I quote him, disturbances in the air turn into meaningful music from the acoustic to the social to the personal. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone, and thanks for coming to this afternoon talk. My name is Christine, and I'm a student of Michael's, and I'm going to talk to you today about some research that occurred in my classroom a few years ago, and this was done under an action research framework. So if you're not quite sure what action research is, it's a form of practitioner research where the researcher is actively involved with the participants in terms of collecting data and constructing theory from that data. So this particular action research project was done in my school and within the class that I was teaching at the time, which is a senior secondary college with a specific orientation in popular music. So the component that I bring to the discussion on concepts today relates specifically to the arrival of the popular musician within senior secondary classrooms in particular, and to what extent the concepts framework works for that student and to what extent it falls short of meeting that student's needs. This is significant because this type of student typically will undertake the Music 1 course, which is the course that Michael introduced, and the music concepts framework is currently the only framework for knowledge that is presented to that student within the 2 years that they study in senior secondary school. So the study that I conducted with this, with my class, actually involved a focus on looking at these students' informal learning orientation, so the kind of learning that they had undertaken prior to or outside of the music classroom, and the relationship between that learning orientation and what's available in terms of curriculum and typical classroom practices, teaching and learning interactions, and so on and so forth. In terms of the data that I collected in that classroom, I undertook an initial student survey to find out what these students' musical interests were and what their musical learning orientations were prior to arriving at the school. I also undertook video footage of classroom activity, and that video footage was undertaken with student groups working on their own without a teacher present, and also teacher-student interactions. There were also work samples taken which included written work samples, but also performed work samples and compositions. And I also undertook student and teacher interviews at the end of the project in order to gain additional insight. By way of analysing this data, I transcribed all 10 weeks of classroom footage, and that involved both verbal transcription and also musical transcription of what was happening in the classroom activity. And then I undertook some thematic coding in order to gain a better understanding of what that data was actually saying. So the classroom project was actually 10 weeks duration, and 30 students and 3 teachers participated in that research. I was one of those 3 teachers. The survey found that 26 of my 30 students identified as popular musicians, and this was, as I said, undertaken through the survey data. And interestingly, also, the 3 teachers represented a cross-section of different learning backgrounds. So each of the 3 teachers represented both jazz, popular and classical music, both learning and in practice. The teaching program that I explored was ironically designed to look at a unit of learning on Baroque music. Now, the reason why I did this was that I wanted to examine these students' perceptions of the classroom activity, not just offering them what is currently available in terms of Music 1 syllabus, but integrating them with students from the Music 2 course to look at a full spectrum of informal and formal learning outcomes. So, that just summarises for you how I broke down the 10 weeks. The first phase, which was 5 weeks, sought to facilitate informal learning in friendship groups to construct performance arrangements of a Baroque work from a CD that I provided to all of the students. The second phase, which is where I'm going to hone in today, asked the students in those same groups to construct transcribed versions of their performances, and I gave them a variety of options in order to do that, including graphic notation, traditional staff notation, and digital tools. And we did analysis of both the original and the performed versions of their works using the music concepts framework. In the third phase, which I won't talk about today, the students were offered 2 separate tasks to streamline the process back into separate courses at the conclusion of the research. So this following piece of footage, which I hope you can read, if not I'll read it quickly to you, actually comes from phase 1 of the research. Now the reason why I've sampled it for you today is that it involves a piece of classroom footage without a teacher present, and these particular students who had interest in performing heavy metal were involved in the construction of their arrangement from the CD recording that I had provided. These boys had decided to arrange a Bach fugue in a heavy metal style, and what this piece of transcript relays is their vernacular terminology that they were using in conjunction with their music making. So these 2 particular students who were guitarists, I've got a keyboardist here, and I don't think the drummer comes into this particular one. So if you just read it through, bless, okay, play the first part. And this is responded by not a verbal response, but rather some music making. So here what we can see is that there's a seamless transition between talking and playing as both equally valued forms of musical vocabulary to the students. And so the students go on, I'll let you just read it. They just make decisions about how they're going to instrument, how they're going to orchestrate the arrangement, what kind of textures they're going to use, what kind of riff material they're going to use, and how they're going to sequence this material in relation to the original recording. Now, following on from this, in the second phase, the students sat down with a teacher in order to consolidate their vernacular terminology and their current, very context-dependent understanding of their performance in order to articulate a list of structural terms in order to facilitate the scoring activity. So 3 samples of structural lists ensued from this discussion. So the first came from a rhythm guitarist, and his term here uses the terms intro, chorus, melody, breakdown, harmony, improv. The second guitarist, the lead guitarist, his list is slightly different. Intro, melody or chorus, using those terms interchangeably, improv, key change, chorus in the original key, so he's got an understanding of keys going on as well, and outro. The drummer at the end is a very interesting one to look at because his list of structural terms are highly dependent upon the kind of feel that he's trying to generate for the performance and the way he's actually communicating with the ensemble. So interestingly, he also uses the term breakdown, which I'd noticed occurred frequently on the footage with the students working alone. Now, this term was significant to the students because it cued for them not only specific musical material, but also the kind of style and feel that they were trying to achieve in their arrangement. Now, what's interesting about this particular list is then the teacher gets involved with the discussion. Now, this particular piece of footage here shows the teacher trying to come to some form of consensus as to what the boys meant by their idiosyncratic list of terms. So you can see here the teacher says, what is the intro? Xavier, Blair comes in and then I play the melody and then it goes like straight into a breakdown. apologies for the frequency of the term like. These are 16-year-olds. Teacher to Xavier. So you play an improvised or a rubato melody at the start. What's rubato mean? Teacher, it's kind of out of time. Is that what it was? Hesitant. I think so. Is this when it's during the opening? But we didn't have like a set time there. It was very slow, was it? Reiterating this after one of the boys mumbles the word slower. Yeah. So what you can see starting to happen in this particular interaction is the students' previously very confident responses as to what they understood their structural terms meant become disempowered when the teacher gets involved and starts to superimpose some unfamiliar and perhaps foreign technical terms over their very context-dependent but very meaningful terms that they had generated in the performance context. From this particular discussion, further synthesizing of the classroom discourse ensues. So what you can actually see on the right-hand side here is a summary of what the students were saying about their structure and the reinterpretation of this language by the teacher in order to come up with some slightly tidier version of their talking. What I've highlighted there, and I'll just give you a moment to read that, the red terms are where there's some form of terminology dissonance ensuing in the discussion. You'll probably notice straight away that there's a tendency to utilise classical terminology on the teacher's part and an absence of incorporation of the very meaningful terminology that the boys had generated for their performance in his list. So to move on very quickly, what can happen as a result of these kind of teaching interactions is the following. So this is one boy's concepts report that he submitted in written form at the end of this process. So this particular student is describing a heavy metal performance which occurred only several weeks prior, and the red words here are I think, dissonant forms of terminology that don't really sit particularly well with his discussion of heavy metal music. So perhaps what could have ensued with the preceding discussion is use of the boys' terms, but enriching that discussion by perhaps fleshing out what it is that they meant by those terms in more commonly understood terms. So I decided to question the teacher at the end of this process about this kind of transition that I'd seen between phase 1 and phase 2. Now what's ironic about this is that this same teacher had worked with these students in phase 1, and in the context of their practical music making, the terminology didn't come up for discussion. It was he was quite happy for the boys to use their terminology within that context. It's when it transitions to a more formal, analytical situation where the students are required to create a consensual list and particularly submit it in written form that these kinds of transitions and dissonances occurred. So the teacher responds in terms to my question about their use of language. He says, well, it's funny that you should say that because I remember saying that if you don't know what something is, if you don't know the Italian term, then use the English term, which they've done just here in the score with the term freely, see? But my understanding was that after all, it is still Baroque, right? So no matter what it boils down to, it is still that, right? So you need to use some terminology that shows the relationship of their arrangement to Baroque music, right? That was my understanding. So what I think is interesting about this, this particular quote from the interview transcript is that his understanding had changed within the context of that phase 2 mode of learning, which was the more formal phase, and it didn't occur earlier on. So there's a bit of a break, a bit of a disjunction between what happens in that freer context where music making is the focus and when the focus of learning turns to formal analysis and written discussion. So, solutions. How do we fix this? Well, obviously, there's no easy fix. here are some proposals that I have based on the research findings that I've currently generated. The first is primarily listening to student talk whilst observing music making. This is possibly, as teacher researcher, the most valuable learning that I undertook, in that instead of assuming that I knew the answers and directing them straight away towards what was going to be validated in an assessment context, I stopped, I listened, I observed, I understood and recorded what they were saying and coupled this what was happening in terms of music making. The second is viewing the teaching encounter also as a learning encounter, as I've said. Thirdly, finding opportunities for an exchange of terms and definitions, creating common understanding. Now, this actually happened later on, where I sat down with the boys and asked them to describe for me what a breakdown was. And they took great delight in playing me numerous musical examples and describing the kinds of things that a breakdown would ensue at a concert, the kind of dance moves that would accompany this kind of section in the music, and what it meant to them in very personal terms. From that, I was able to springboard that discussion and introduce some structural observations and some rhythmic observations that I thought were interesting in terms of what I was hearing them saying, and that actually enriched their understanding of how they were using the term in the context of their music making. The fourth, was to support terminology with graphic depictions and other forms of notation, including digital forms. Now, this may sound very Eurocentric, however, the use of symbols in accompanying with terminology provided a greater level of objectivity in both, particularly in the presentation of written comments. Fifthly, building competence by providing schemas and examples for organising written analysis. And there are a number of textbooks for concepts out there that I'm sure have great use, but definitely moving beyond dot points in terms of making commentary meaningful. Expanding classroom discourse to embrace the social context and meanings associated with music, and to enforce Michael's point, the growth of school musicology. And lastly, something that Michael said in preparation for this talk, that we need to embrace not only how music works, but also what it means. And I think perhaps this is the great missing piece in the puzzle, which might enrich this whole area of classroom activity. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Arvid.
They're running away.
To run back to their conducting.
No tricky questions
Thank you
for
very
them.
much, Michael and Christine. Absolutely fantastic. And I've made lots of notes, and I'm sure that you've got questions as well as we get to the crux of exactly what a fugal breakdown is. So I'll invite them from the audience rather than jump in first myself. Does anybody want to come up, Michael, so you can both...
Do you want to question Michael first or me first? Or neither of us?
I think both of you.
Do you just want drinks? No.
All right, no one's jumping straight in, so I'll
We
jump
don't
in.
bite.
Do you feel, either of you, both of you, do you feel that there is enough freedom within the syllabus currently to adopt? Michael mentioned new subdisciplines of musicological analysis, and Christine, you've in many ways suggested some of your own new approaches, such as exchanging terms and definitions. Do you feel there's enough space to move within the current syllabus to actually adopt some of these approaches now without disadvantaging students who are, after all, being directed towards one big assessment at the end of stage 6?
Well, I think part of the problem that we're dealing with is that we've got a syllabus document in the first place, which isn't necessarily evil. You have to have one, but getting the balance between being too prescriptive or not prescriptive enough is a real challenge for whoever, the committees that put these things together. So you want to leave some flexibility and freedom. I think the process that I referred to, technic-ization, where the tool becomes the thing and the phenomenon music becomes subservient to the tool somehow, is also a problem with a syllabus. So that a syllabus is used as a guideline for the sorts of things that you have to teach, or that you're required to teach, but The problem is that people hold onto it so tightly that it almost replaces the sorts of ideas and content that you would plug into it. So that you look for the signs in the code to decipher what it exactly means. And I've actually been at a couple of the different points in the process. And so if you work at the if you work on the examination committee setting the HSC exams, you find that those committees are caught in a bind by having to adhere relatively closely to previous exams, because you can't surprise candidates too much. And then when you beg for innovation at that point, because the syllabus will allow it, the question is, well, we've got to keep the poor teachers in mind. So I think a part of the problem is the whole systematization of education, and we can't dismantle that right here tonight in the next few minutes. But it is an issue with the way, I think it's, no matter how much you encourage students that the syllabus is a guideline, and if they go away feeling relatively relaxed about that when they leave here, they soon get it beaten into them by other colleagues and teachers that they're working with in the system, that you can't have such a free and easy attitude to this thing. It's everything. So they quickly doubt themselves and so forth and move. So yeah, it's a multiple. Is the syllabus open enough to absorb development? I think probably it is, but the other thing is we can't teach everything. Okay, but I think that we're making good progress in areas in education in general. So the whole idea of cultural competency, for example, with respect, say, to Indigenous cultures in Australia, that takes into account settler colonialism, and it tries to critique and unpack those sorts of things. And we're starting to understand ideologies of race and how they've had an impact upon the ways that we treat people and the ways that we hear their music, and all kinds of things. So we're making those kinds of developments in relation to Indigenous culture in Australia. We've already made some moves in relation to old sort of multiculturalism policy and so forth. But I think these become sort of add-ons to the syllabus, and they don't sort of permeate from the ground up. And so somehow we've got to cope with this in terms of the way we prepare, in our pre-service program, we prepare teachers, but also we've got to get at the source documents. You've got to get everywhere and start to say we need to rethink the processes that are going on here. Christine?
Same question or different question?
Well, I wondered if you wanted to add to that. I mean, if you're adopting students' own words, does that make you nervous in terms of preparing them for the final exam? Or
Very, very, incredibly. So this is, as a teacher, I think you're in an incredible bind, because while the focus of, 99% of what you do with these students is learning, ultimately the 1% of time that they spend in that examination room seems to usurp all focus for the preceding 99% of the time that you have, certainly in many school contexts. And that is unfortunately a sad reality. I think the thing that's encouraging, though, is that the system of the syllabus, the concepts framework, is reasonably open-ended to a point, and flexible and permeable to change. So it is only a loose framework, and I think the potential to flesh that out further is there. So just looking back in terms of marking commentaries that you can see on websites such as the BOSTES website, it's interesting to note that in recent documents where students are asked to describe popular music, terminology including riff and the like is now accepted terminology, whereas I don't think you would have found that 10, 20 years ago. You may have had a classical type alternative such as ostinato offered as valid comment instead. So I think what's interesting about that is the field of school music education is changing. The nature of teachers' musical backgrounds and their training in popular and contemporary music is on the increase. And I think what we are going to see is a vast shift occur in this over the next 10 to 20 years that we haven't perhaps seen before. Now, whether that will result in creating conversation between different kinds of musicological discourses and their representation in examination documents or the like, or whether it creates a further polarisation of what we can see in terms of practice is yet to be seen. But if we remain optimistic and open to learning, we can hope for the former rather than the latter.
Dr. Larkin.
Michael, your analysis of effectively the cart before the horse, or at least replacing the object with the methods used to describe it, could seem, from my perspective, to have a simple solution. I mean, simple conceptually, wrong word. Simple in terms of the idea, if not in terms of how you put it into practice, which I don't know anything about. I mean, a long time ago in a galaxy far away, when I was doing the equivalent of the HSC, we had set works. It's probably inimical to the kind of more open curriculum that seems to be obtained in Australia. But at least you weren't sort of just mining them for details. You hopefully would reflect back on them. And I think what you seem to be asking for is an element of synthesis. Analysis always precedes synthesis. So you break it down, you find some interesting things about the materials, and then hopefully you can bring them back together. So, whatever the set of the work is, one of the things we had to study was Copeland's El Salamanca. Now, we didn't do too much in this, but you could immediately sort of say, okay, let's break it down, talk about the musical elements, and let's use those to reflect on what the representation of Mexico by an American communist Jewish left-wing composer might mean. So that would allow you to bring in this broader spectrum of musicology that
Yeah, Kathy, I don't know if you remember, do we have set works at one point?
Yes, when I went to school, which is in Galaxy even further away. We had set works for the HSC. I think they were. I'm just trying to think when the newer manifestation of syllabus that more closely resembles what we have. I think in the
90s?
late 80s, I think. That's probably about the time that the set works.
Yeah, I mean, part of the issue, I think, I think that's one side of it. I think the other side of so you're suggesting dealing with works that you've studied in detail and in advance, so they're not sort of surprised onto you and then tell me something about what you hear in this. So you're just sort of putting a grid onto a piece onto 5 minutes of sound and
we have both actually, small tests of the other
unprepared and go ahead.
But there is an extent to which the set work de facto still exists, which is that the current syllabus, which dates to 95, I think, for Music 2, Stage 6, the exam always includes question 4, which is an extended response. It's not very extended, it's only 20 minutes, but it generally focuses on any work you have studied, works you have studied from music of the last 25 years in Australia focus. And until 3 years ago, something like 70% of the candidates would write an answer about Kakadu, Buckhill, Peterson. Close to half of them last year were writing about 2 or 3 works by Matthew Heinsohn. Effectively, the set works are there because the teachers know the good resources are available to teach to those works. But there's no cultural context there at all. They're simply talking about what's happening in the score and not why.
Yeah. That part of my critique, and I think the other side of my critique is in a sense that part of it is the way the analytical tool is being used and not particularly in not a particularly nuanced way. And that's not to say that it couldn't be. But another part of it is it was a bit dense, that part of the 10-minute paper. It requires a very close look at the syllabuses and where they actually mention and claim what musicology actually is or don't actually tell you what they're talking about, that essentially they are talking about musicology. But the second part of my argument, it's really the body of my argument that affects the analysis, is that it's largely divorced from musicology. Analysis is largely divorced from musicology. Or musicology is sort of obscured in the syllabuses in certain ways, and then when it does come back, it's in this sort of hierarchical kind of way that it's trying to be egalitarian. So it's sort of going, you guys are dealing with music where it'd be better to have an oral conversation about them. You guys are dealing with music from a score, it would be better to write an essay. But I think that part of this sort of lack of coherence or clarity means that teachers, it's part of the problem is that teachers don't really know what musicology is either, I reckon. I mean, that's a pretty bold claim. I don't have a lot of data to claim that, to suggest, just to back that up, but I just think that they're not really sure. And I think the other thing is that, Christine was saying to me in conversation late this afternoon, that teachers know, one thing, a relatively easy way to get students engaged in a classroom is to get them playing something, so performing is fine. Making up your own music's another way to do it, but if you just think musicology is talking about stuff, then you kind of, you'll leave that. We're always saying, don't talk about music so much, don't talk about it, do stuff, don't talk so much. But, do active kind of teaching and involvement in music. So I think partly that if we don't find compelling ways to get musicology reintegrated into this idea of musicianship as the big picture, then we're really failing. And a friend I was talking to on the weekend said that Keith Swanwick, a music education theorist, was essentially saying that if you're not operating from the point of theory, you're basically dead. Because we all intuitively operate from the basis of theory anyway. And I don't mean theory in the terms of sort of scales and time signatures and whatnot, but what informs musical practice, what makes this a piece of music, for example. We have an understanding behind that if we consider this music or don't, when we make these kinds of judgments. So there's something about how our understanding of music is informed by theory. We just need to draw that out in interesting and compelling ways. So I think it's the detail about the significance of why we're actually dealing with music in the classroom anyway. I think that's a really tricky thing. We shouldn't just think if we just think of musicology as all the sort of talking stuff about music.
Study.
We've got a problem.
Serious stuff.
We have time for one more quick question, if anyone is burning. In that case, I will thank Christine and Michael in a second, but before I do a very quick plug for our next lecture, which is in 2 weeks in About Music Education, with Brad Fuller from Northern Beaches Christian School, who is, it's quite funny because they both wrote their titles separately and they came to me at the same time, and I've made the posters today. And the next one is about why the syllabus isn't an excuse for poor teaching. So I think we'll be picking up a lot of the same questions and having a lot of the same discussions. I would invite you all to join us in the atrium bar now for some snacks and drinks. And please thank Michael and Christine.
Thank you.